You saw the movie, right? Was it fun? Did you have a good time with the movie? All right. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the movie and about what it, about the implications. When the free speech movement succeeded, nobody was more astounded than I was. And indeed, nobody was more astounded than the leadership of the FSM, like Mario and other people. Also, there were lots of infighting inside the organization itself, lots of hostility and jealousy, as you can imagine. But I, in particular, was astounded by the success of the FSM because I've been myself active in student protest movements in the 1950s. And one thing we all took for granted was we would lose, but we would defend our values and stand up for moral rights. And to my total amazement, in 1964, we won, far bigger than I had ever expected that we could win, and I think far bigger than anybody who was active at the time expected. And that led me to a question: how did it work? How could we actually have succeeded? Many of the things that happened were comic to the point of ridiculousness. I thought, for example, Mario's famous speech, which was very moving and very effective rhetorically, was a ridiculous farce as far as its intellectual content is concerned. He told about how oppressed we all were, how we were victims of the great machine that was crushing us. The truth is, there had never been such a privileged generation in the history of the United States. They all knew they were going to get a BA. They all knew that there would be jobs available for them when they finished their BA. And if they didn't want a job, if they just wanted to be hippies, well, they could do that too. There were all these options open. Your generation is not nearly so well favored. It's not so clear to me that you'll be able to afford your education, and that's becoming less and less likely daily. And when you get your education, the job situation isn't nearly so favorable. But in 1964, part of the fun of being so privileged was feeling so oppressed and fighting against oppression. There were some unintended consequences of the FSM that you will not be reminded of in the movie. The two chief effects of the FSM were totally unintended. One was it made the political career of Ronald Reagan. That's not much of an exaggeration. Politically, he was largely unknown prior to that, but he decided to run for the governorship, and the chief political reporter of the Los Angeles Times, a very intelligent man, said, it's like hearing Donald Duck for governor. I mean, he was a famous movie star, and his fame was largely that he'd been married to a rather successful actress whose name, in my jet lag, I've forgotten, but she was actually rather good. Jane Wyman. He was married to somebody who was actually famous. And that was his chief fame, was that he was married to Jane Wyman, and she was actually a famous actress. He was largely a second-tier actor in B movies, and he had some more leading parts, but he was not a great success. But he made a career as a politician. And this same reporter for the Los Angeles Times, who had to go from a stump to hear him make his stump speech, it's all politicians make the same speech over and over. He noticed wherever he went, the biggest applause came when Reagan promised to clean out the mess at Berkeley. And what is the mess? Well, look in the mirror. You are the mess. And what is it exactly that constitutes the mess? Drugs and sex and rock and roll were the three great slogans of the time. It's hard to believe that that was taken seriously, but I cannot tell you the way that resonated with the voters. This same reporter told me his biggest applause came, the greatest source of enthusiasm came when he attacked Berkeley and promised to clean out the mess in Berkeley. And of course, what he proposed was, as he must have known, ridiculous, is that the faculty members should just take those awful students and pick them up by their hind legs and throw them out of the university. Well, you might as well tell Ronald Reagan, you don't like those faculty members? Why don't you have them arrested when he was governor? Of course, it doesn't work like that. You can't do that. But in any case, we made the political career of Ronald Reagan. He went from success to success. There are some nice footnotes to this, which are really off of the subject of the movie, but are worth mentioning. The single most stunning event of Reagan's presidency was the collapse of communism. Now, what actually happened was this. Reagan had a theory, and the theory was, if you arm to the teeth, they will be forced to negotiate. You see, Carter didn't have a theory. His theory was, well, you know, arms are terrible. We mustn't have any arms. But Reagan's theory was, if you arm yourself enormously, they will be forced to negotiate because they can't keep up. They can't afford it. What actually happened was, if you arm to the teeth, they simply collapse. By trying to keep up, they simply destroyed their economy and failed altogether. They just collapsed. Now, it's interesting to see how history is going to be rewritten. Nobody knew that they were going to collapse. But I've talked to people who worked in the Reagan White House, and they told me, we all knew that. We all knew that by arming to the teeth, we would force the Soviet Union to collapse. Well, I don't believe that, but I do, because at the time they had a theory that was more or less well known among people who care about these things, and that was armed to the teeth, and then they will be forced to negotiate because they can't keep up. They cannot keep up the level of expenditure necessary. But what in fact happened was that as you know, the system collapsed. Okay, but now so that was the first unintended effect of the free speech movement, was that it created the political career of Ronald Reagan, and then of course he had to keep going. I mean, he was a very effective politician, and I think he fully understood the importance of image as opposed to reality in modern American politics. If you asked the voters at random who was more likely to have run a federal deficit, Billy Clinton or Ronald Reagan, everybody would say, well, the liberal Democrat, Clinton. Of course, Clinton ran a budget surplus, and Reagan ran colossal deficits. While busy pleading that there should be an amendment against deficit spending, there should be a balanced budget constitutional amendment, and preaching the doctrine of fiscal discipline, in fact, Reagan ran up a huge federal deficit. Okay, so that was one effect of the free speech movement that no one could have predicted. Another effect was less visible, but in fact, I think if you talk to any university administrator who has a sense of history, they would appreciate this, and that it was an end to the doctrine of in loco parentis. And part of the problem was that the general public assumed that this doctrine was still in force. What it means legally is that the university has a responsibility for the behavior of the students because, legally speaking, the university plays the role of the parents. This means in place of the parents. And until the free speech movement, there was still life in this theory. It was the traditional theory of American universities that universities were the university administration played the role of the father and the mother. They were supposed to look after you. As the dean of women told me at the University of Wisconsin when I was a student body president, she said solemnly, girls are different from boys. Girls can become pregnant. And this was the great horror, the great fear of the dean of women at the University of Wisconsin, was pregnancy of the students. Why should she give a damn? Well, it was in loco parentis. They were acting in place of the parent. And the FSM killed that. I mean, after that, word of the FSM was, as you can imagine, on national television all the time. After that, it was much imitated. However, from a purely theoretical view, I wondered, how did it work? We were no smarter in 1964 than our predecessors had been in 1952. I know because I was present both times. And the question is, why did it work in 1964? Well, there were certain historical changes. And the decisive difference, the historical event without which you cannot understand the student protest movements of the 1960s, was the civil rights movement. The techniques of the FSM had been learned by many of the leaders who had actually been active in the South, who had actually been active in the civil rights movements in the southern states. and they turned out to be much more effective against university deans than they were against Southern sheriffs. And I'm going to tell you specifically how they worked in a moment. But the television dramatization of the civil rights movement in the 60s presented a model. It presented an ideal which was immensely appealing to a whole generation of students, people who had been inspired by the election of John Kennedy and who wanted to do something morally worthwhile, were inspired by the civil rights movement. And the techniques and ideals of the civil rights movement were imitated. In 1964, the ideal was nonviolence. It's interesting that throughout the country, it was constantly described as the riots in Berkeley. And relatives of mine wanted to know, was I threatened? Was I in danger from all the riots in Berkeley? I hardly could tell them, look, I'm one of the chief rioters as far as the television is concerned. But of course, there were no riots. There was no violence at all in 1964. It got worse much later. It got much worse. But in 64, in the actual free speech movement, there was no violence at all. The only incident of violence that I know of for a fact was that Mario bit a policeman on his ankle when the guy was pushing his ankle into his face. But that's the only actually authenticated case of violence that I know throughout that. Okay, how did it work? Well, I watched a number of these, and it was when I was in Paris in '68. And by the way, you had enormous prestige and entree into Paris in the great événement of '68. If you could tell them, I'm from Berkeley. And you immediately were allowed through the lines, and everybody wanted your advice on what to do and so on. So in any case, what happened? Well, it seemed to me all of the successful and even the unsuccessful, but the successful student revolts in the 60s invariably went through 3 stages. And the first stage I call the creation of an issue. Now, you might think there were enormous varieties of issues. It could be protests against the war in Vietnam, a protest against racism, protests against restrictions on free speech in the case of Berkeley, protests against American imperialism at various European places. How did it work and why was it so important? All of the events that I knew of had a common formal feature, a common structural feature, and that was, just to have a label, I call this, there has to be a sacred topic. There has to be something that matters to the ideals of students. There has to be a sacred topic, and you have to connect that to the university administration. The university administration has to be made out to be the villain on the sacred topic. Now, the 3 favorite sacred topics were free speech initially, and then later racism, and then finally and most effectively the war in Vietnam. Now, what was unique to this generation of student protesters was the ability to connect the university administration with the forces of evil on the sacred topic. See, I was a secretary of an organization called Students Against McCarthy. That was against Joe McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin. It never occurred to accuse the university administration of being in cahoots with McCarthy because he was one of their victims. I mean, he was a target. But what the effective student radicals of the 60s did was to tell the students that, look, your real enemy is in the dean's office. You see, and there was a theory that went behind this. The structure of power in the United States is a seamless web that stretches from the Pentagon to the dean's office. And they're all racist and imperialist. They're all busy bombing Vietnamese peasants and oppressing black people throughout the United States and the rest of the world. So you want to strike a blow for human freedom? Here's a brick. Throw it through the window of the dean's office, and you will be striking a blow for human freedom. So this was the formal structure which distinguished the protest movement of the 60s from previous student protest movement, was the ability to connect the university administration with the forces of evil on a sacred topic. When some guy was busy smashing up Grinnell Hall and was arrested, his friends came to me and said, but he was fighting for freedom in Vietnam. And I try to point out to them, he doesn't know where Saigon is or how it differs from Haiphong, Hue, and Ho Chi Minh City. But in any case, that was the image that was projected. The idea was that because the university is responsible for racism, imperialism, and restriction of free speech, then you will be striking a blow for the sacred topic by striking a blow against the university. Now, why was this so important? Well, the answer is very simple. You want to bring down the Pentagon, it's a tough battle. That's hard to do. You want to bring down the dean or the chancellor, that's a picnic. It's turned out to be rather easy to do. So this was immensely effective. Stage one, you create an issue, and the way you do it is you violate university rules in the name of the sacred topic. Now, you will be helped enormously by the stupidity of your adversaries. Who on earth would think you got a large number of people in a state of extreme agitation? Well, send a police car in and arrest somebody. I mean, how dumb can you be? But that's exactly what happened, as you saw in the movie. And I have to say, I thought it was slightly comical. I love the fact that all these Americans, with their respect for cars, they didn't respect much else, but cars they did. Everybody took their shoes off before getting on top of the police car. They didn't want to mark up the police car. And the mythology is enormous. I have spoken to people, eyewitnesses, who personally saw me haranguing the masses from atop the police car. I wouldn't go near a police car. I mean, in a situation like that. It's not my style. But I know people who said, that they saw me on the police car. It's total nonsense, of course, and maybe this is how history is rewritten at all times. But in any case, you will be helped by the stupidity of your adversaries, and then there's something else to be learned here. Experience is the worst teacher. The most intelligent person in all of this was probably Clark Kerr. He was extremely intelligent, but he was hopelessly ill-prepared for the free speech movement because he'd had a life of dealing with human conflict, particularly labor management negotiation. He was the best labor management negotiator in the United States, and he simply applied the techniques of labor management negotiation to this conflict. It didn't work. Why not? Well, in one word, because the people side were not interested in a resolution by compromise. Interested in mediated resolution. On the contrary, they were interested in forcing the issue. Stage one ends when you have violations of university rules, massive violations that result in the arrest and preferably university discipline against a number of the violators. And this is what happened in Berkeley, Columbia, and Paris, and a number of other places. Stage two is the development of a rhetorical climate. And I don't have a vocabulary for this, so I had to invent this vocabulary. And what you do then is you have lots of speeches and demonstrations, and the theme of these is that the university authorities are really the villain on the sacred topic, and we now have proof. The proof is that Jones has been arrested, and furthermore, Smith is subject to university discipline. Why? Because they protested against the war in Vietnam, because they stood up for free speech, because they tried to strike a blow against racism. What was more racist than the Columbia University attempting to construct a gym on the very edge of Harlem? And this was proof of racism, and if you doubted that proof, the conclusive evidence was that Jones and Smith were both being subject to terrible, terrible deprivation. Why? For fighting against racism. Okay, and this you develop, this goes on, this can go on for weeks, as it did in Berkeley, and two new elements enter here. And it's hard for you to appreciate the importance of the first of these today, but it was a big deal in the 1960s. Television. There was an ontology to television. I doubt if it still exists. Except for football games and important events like that, I never turn on the television. But in those days, it was a big deal. And ontologically, if the student could go and demonstrate on Sproul Plaza at lunchtime and then go home and watch himself on the 6 o'clock news, it was no longer just an undergraduate event, it was history. You doubt that this is history? Turn on your TV set. There we are on national, some often local, but sometimes national television. And of course, at first the TV guys didn't know what to make of this. What the hell's going on here? You know, they thought it was a bunch of kids acting up. But they then discovered it's great TV. It's fantastic TV. Why? Well, first of all, when nothing else is going on, you can pan around, and there's that good-looking, long-haired girl there with the hair down to her waist, and you can the television camera can rest on her until you get a great speech from Mario or Steve or whoever. So it's a combination of effective rhetoric together with young people, masses of young people who always look better than masses of old people. In any case, and then you see, then you can have the best of all. Police conflict, and you can have a confrontation where the cops and the demonstrators sit and look at each other for 10 hours. But there's one moment when the kid says something and the cop hits him. That's on national news. I mean, and that is a total distortion of what was actually occurring. But the one incident that is captured on TV footage can then be sent out nationally. Okay, stage 2 ends with a massive demonstration, preferably including the mass arrests of lots of people, and that leads to the collapse of authority. And the familiar phenomenon, anybody who cares about revolutions will recognize this. Once the rhetorical climate is suitably structured, nothing destroys authority like its dramatic exercise. The dramatic exercise of authority in the form of large numbers of police arresting large numbers of people serves to destroy authority altogether. And the destruction of the authority in Berkeley, as in several other places, was marked by the defection of the faculty. The ultimate a status function recognition in a university is the faculty. If the faculty no longer recognizes your authority, if the faculty sides with your opponents, then you have lost your authority. And that's what happened in Berkeley with the passage of the famous December 8th revolution. Now, at the time, I thought, my God, it's wonderful. By a vote of 7-1, the faculty has come out in favor of our ideals. I now don't think that's what happened. I think the faculty members didn't know what the hell was going on. They were sick of the whole issue, and they just thought, well, this is the way to bring a stop to it. But in any case, the faculty vote served to destroy the authority of the administration, and it led to the resignation of the chancellor and his replacement by an interim chancellor, and then eventually a replacement of that of the temporary chancellor. But the authority which had been effectively undermined by all of these events was destroyed by the faculty resolution of December 8th. Now, it's interesting that Clark Kerr never understood what was going on. The Greek theater meeting, and you saw that in the movie, was a stupid gesture on the administration, because by that time they were far too weakened. You see, Clark thought, well, look, I got the 90 different department chairmen to come out and vote unanimously for this. At that point, nobody cared about a department chairman. Who cares about a damn department chairman when 800 of your students have been arrested and carted off to jail? So it was too late. Clark was busy trying to play out things that would have worked 6 months earlier or 6 years earlier, but it was too late. And of course, then any mass meeting, you lay yourself open to your adversaries. In Clark's case, Mario got up and grab the mic, and it was you couldn't, as a Greek drama, you couldn't have done it more effectively. The cops stupidly grabbed Mario and pulled his tie off, or whatever, or grabbed him by the tie, and he didn't have one of these button-on ties. He actually was tied around like this one, tied around his neck, and of course that's the image that everybody retained. Nobody remembers what Clark and the other speakers actually said. What they remember is Mario being dragged off by the cops. Okay, this is how to do it. If you wanted to run a successful student revolt, the way you do it is you tie your adversary to the forces of evil on the sacred topic. You create a rhetorical climate by violating rules in such a way as to make it impossible for the university not to try to enforce the rules. And then after you build up a sufficient rhetorical climate, you bring down the whole institution by provoking a massive exercise of the rules. Now, I left out in stage 2, I mentioned the TV, but you have to involve the faculty at this stage. You cannot, people thought erroneously, well, students, they don't care about anybody who's over the age of 30. That's not true. They desperately needed faculty approval, and a certain number of faculty members became involved in Berkeley, as they did in other places, and that was crucial to the success of the movement. Now, I was struck by this, that it occurred in every place that I studied or visited, most dramatically at Columbia. And there were interesting things. After any of these happened, any one of these events happened, there are always committees to study it. This is a stroke of American genius, is that any event can be studied to death. But all of the studies of each place, all were done by people from other places, and the line was always the same. What happened in Berkeley could never happen at, and then fill in your favorite, Stanford or UCLA. Columbia was my favorite because they brought in all these people from other Ivy League colleges, and they said, well, it was a special problem of Columbia and its incompetent administration. It could never happen at, and then they listed all the places where it subsequently happened. The events were repeated in a widespread fashion throughout the country, and there were places like Wisconsin or Berkeley, big state universities where they were dramatic, where the events were more dramatic, but the pattern was widely repeated. And then when I was on sabbatical in Paris, I was amazed to see the same thing happening all over again in Paris. Okay, so that's what you see in the movie, though the movie doesn't quite present it that way. Now, why not? What's the purpose of the movie? Well, in fact, now it seems to me there are really two movies. There's half which you saw about the free speech movement, and there's a second half which is less interesting to me, where it really does get off the campus and involves things that go beyond the campus, and I was less interested in that, and you didn't get to see the whole movie. But the first part is what I was anxious that you should see, because it describes this pattern that I have that I've sketched out here. And now, why did the guy make the movie? Well, you might think it's just a good subject for a movie, and it's a pretty good documentary film. In fact, the particular filmmaker, Mark Kitchell, was too young to have participated in the FSM, but he became obsessed by it. And unfortunately, it became a kind of career for him. And I don't know what eventually happened to him, because after he made this movie, he told me he wanted to develop a television series about Berkeley in the 60s. He wanted to make a career out of this, and it's just not that interesting. I mean, it was kind of fun for a while, and it'd be interesting to know what happened to him. He was a nice guy, and he made a good movie. He had help from Saul Zentz, who also did a lot of movies and who lent Zentz's facilities here, Saul Zentz's studio. Okay, now, when I published this, there was general outrage, so I knew I must be saying something right when I published this outline. I mean, it wasn't anything like the outrage to the Chinese room. There really was outrage, but I knew I was on the right track when this was met with when there were howls of outrage at this analysis. But in any case, it seemed to me to explain a lot of the phenomena that were puzzling to me. The chief puzzle I had was, how on earth did we win? I was used to being beaten. All the forces were on the other side. And the answer, you know, is we won by removing the acceptance of the system of status functions. We removed the acceptance of the system of status functions by removing their legitimacy. And we removed their legitimacy by identifying them with the forces of evil on a sacred topic. Now, why was that so important? Well, there are several other things that struck me. No student revolt about student interests like tuition or degree requirements or living arrangements in the dorms or even faculty members who were popular with the students who were being fired, none of them ever succeeded. Not a one. There were many efforts to run successful student revolts over radical faculty members who had been fired, over the fact that there was a tuition raise, and none of them ever succeeded. They may have made a lot of noise in the short run, but they did not succeed. Now, of course, history changes. Maybe there will be something dramatic happening now that will alter this general pattern. I don't believe it. I think it's unlikely that there will be a successful student revolt over something which is in the self-interest of the demonstrators, namely that there should be lower tuition. Essentially, moral outrage is a middle-class luxury. And I mean, really poor, oppressed people cannot afford moral outrage. And so to get people morally outraged, you cannot say you should be morally outraged because they want to charge you more money. You can only, I mean, notice the rhetoric. The rhetoric is always, this is a threat to public education. This is a threat to the ideals of universal education. Not, it's a threat to my pocketbook. It is a threat to my pocketbook, but that's not why middle-class people will demonstrate. Middle-class people will demonstrate, and demonstrations are largely middle-class activity. A moral outrage is a middle-class luxury, and they will demonstrate, if you can convince them, that there's some universal moral principle that's being violated. Now that, in my diagnosis, is why there was no successful student revolt on matters of student self-interest. They always had to be aimed at some universal ideal. Now, as I say, experience is the worst teacher, and maybe the situation has changed and there will be successful revolts about tuition rises. I doubt it, but that was my experience in the 60s. None of those ever worked. The food in the student eating halls may be terrible. You never have a successful student revolt that brings down the chancellor over bad food or high tuition. You have to do it over some sacred topic. There has to be some great moral ideal. Okay, so let's have comments about that, and I'll be interested in anybody's comment what you thought of the movie. And I still find it quite moving to see this movie. And indeed, when I showed it to this class a year ago, I actually burst into tears. So ridiculous, but anyway, I did. Watching our heroic efforts. Well, I won't go on with the characterization. Questions or comments about what I've been saying? I got fed up with the press accounts that I read, so I wrote a book about it called The Campus War. As far as I can tell, as Hume said about his first book, the book fell stillborn from the press. It was translated into some foreign languages and got some attention abroad, but it wasn't what people... This is the most idealistic and wonderful generation of people that ever occurred. And what I wrote was that much like any other generation, they happened to be more successful because they had a set of mechanisms that worked more effectively. Okay, questions about that or comments? Because then I'm going to go on to another topic. There's some other things I want to say.
Are you saying that people just won't, they don't have the moral outrage over bad food in the cafeteria?
It is very hard. See, it's very hard for middle-class people to become morally outraged over something that's in their own self-interest. You can only do that if you can disguise their self-interest as representing a universal moral ideal. I'm not on strike to save myself money. I'm on strike to save the principle of public education. This is why one of the silliest aspects of the recent demonstrations was the idea there are 23 members of the university custodial staff who are losing their jobs, and we're really on about them. I mean, the idea that I'm just on strike because I don't want to pay more tuition and my parents don't want to pay more tuition, that's hard. a movement going with that rhetoric. You've got to make a general ideal for the working class or the oppressed races or what have you. Yes?
Would it tend to be like with class background? Because I know in the Philippines there's a polytechnic university in the Philippines, and that's considered like this very working class university.
Yeah.
And maybe it was because it was extreme. They wanted to raise tuition 1,700%.
Yeah.
And so they got together and they burned all these desks and they blocked everything and they
Yeah.
beat up a bunch of cops and stole all their riot gear.
Yeah.
And the administration, and they said
They gave in.
No, we
Yeah.
don't want
Yeah.
tuition fee increases.
Yeah.
And the administration was like, we never considered it.
I see. That's great. Well, I don't know about, I don't have a feel for the situation in the Philippines. The places that I'm familiar with are the United States, Canada, France, Germany, and Great Britain. I mean, I'm pretty comfortable with those cultures. And in my experience in those places, it was always a middle-class action. See, think of Mario's speech. You couldn't make that speech if you're actually oppressed, if you're actually being ground-bound by this great thing. You can only really make that speech in an appealing way to people who are pretty comfortable. People are pretty comfortable about their lives and their futures, and that's why the speech seemed to me a ridiculous farce. But it's important to understand that as far as public perceptions are concerned, what seems from the outside like a ridiculous farce can seem wonderfully moving. And the speech has become a kind of textbook case. It's repeated in anthologies. And I no doubt, not your generation, but subsequent generations will shake their heads as they think about the terrible oppression that people suffered from in 1964 when they had to choose between business school and law school and humanities or whatever horrible choice they were confronted with. But in fact, it was the best off generation in American history, certainly better than anything that happened during the Depression when jobs were really hard to come by. And I think, though I don't have a real feel for your generation, I think the 64 generation was better off than yours. Education cost a lot less and the opportunities were much greater once you finished your education. Yes?
I was going to ask about the Depression.
Yeah.
That seems like a case in which there was a direct link between self-interest
Yeah.
and a total collapse of authority.
Yeah. Well, tell me about student demonstrations in the Depression.
I don't know.
You see, this is the remarkable thing. Of course, in the Depression, there was a terrible crisis. It's hard for you to realize today what it's like if 25% of the workforce is unemployed. And of course, that's much more tragic than 25% would be today, because today there are a lot of women employed. So often if one partner loses a job, the other one still has a job. But in 1935, people employed were supporting families were almost all males. And that meant that if you have 25% unemployed, you have 25% of the families in the United States who are in trouble. And there, I think, for the political movements that they supported could well have been designed around self-interest. But there was a peculiarity in the 60s that I'm observing, or that I observed, and that was successful student movements about middle-class students in the United States, France, Britain, and Germany, and I guess in Scandinavia. I didn't study it very closely. In all of those cases, the student movements were never about straight self-interest. They were never about tuition fees, food in the dorm, living unit costs. They were never about things like that. They always had to involve a sacred topic, and they had a formal structure, which was the genius of the 60s. Tie the sacred topic to the university administration. Very hard to overthrow the Pentagon. Even if you think the Pentagon is a source of evil, all the same, you can't overthrow the Pentagon. They tried. They had this night march described by Norman Mailer. But it's not at all hard to destroy the administration of a university. I was amazed at how easy it was. Now, why? I'll take that question. I want to go on with this thought. American institutions proved to have an amazing resiliency, much more so than Europe. And the reason was that though we could destroy the authority of the university administration for a weekend or maybe for a whole semester, the truth is the structural features, the budgets and the secretaries and the filing cabinets and the punch cards. You've never seen a punch card. That's before the days of computers. But all of those remain the same. And after we controlled Sproul Plaza for a few days, well, the weekend came, people went home, and on Monday morning the secretaries were back in their offices with their budgets and their checks and their punch cards and their Social Security numbers and their filing cabinets, and those proved to be incredible weapons of power, because the power structure, by the sheer inertia, went on and on and on, and the irony is it survives today in pretty much the same form. The university has pretty much the same constitutional form. Now, the Europeans made several terrible mistakes. Often in response to this, they would alter the constitutional structure of the university. So they would bring in students on committees designed to appoint faculty members. Now, that's always idiotic. Why? Which student wants to serve on those committees? It's only the most radical students who want to do that. It's not professional intellectuals who get on those committees. It is the radical students who get on the committees, and they make a mess for a long time. I mean, there's no student who's competent to sit on whether or not I should get a pay raise or a promotion. Frankly, I don't think many of my colleagues are, but at least they're candidates for competency. But if you allow a major constitutional changes, you're asking for trouble. In the United States, we didn't. The Constitution of the universities remained pretty much the same. Now, there was a wonderful feature that revolutions have. After the revolution was successful, there was an enormous sense of possibility. We had the feeling we're at day one of the new era. We can write a new constitution of the university, and everybody was doing it. There was a Tussman program and all these programs for student reform, and it was in those days you suddenly realized the sheer impoverishment of the educational theory that the students and the faculty had. What you ask your students, what kind of a university would you like to see? What sort of education would you like? And they would say things like, could we have pass-fail courses? You know, the idea, that was their idea of a real revolutionary change in their educational system. The idea that there might be some totally different way of educating people, it never reached their consciousness. They never got across that. So the sense of enormous possibilities was accompanied by an almost total lack of intellectual grip. There was no theory. And I'll tell you an interesting thing about these events. Though were incredible events at the time, there was almost no intellectually first-rate analyses of them. I think the best is one I wrote, but it was kind of a weekend effort, and you're seeing a chunk of it on the blackboard. And the book, as I mentioned, was a failure. It certainly wasn't welcome at the time. The books that were welcome at the time, there was an idiotic book called The Greening of America by some guy at Yale, whose name I've forgotten, and it said, a new era has come in the United States. The young people are bringing the greening of America. And a new America is going to come out of this, which will be totally different from anything you've ever seen before. Well, it's the same old America. It's true the government has to bail out General Motors. That would have been surprising a generation ago. But in any case, there was an impoverishment of what an educational theory might be, what a different kind of education might be possible. Anyway, other questions? You had a question at the back.
I'm not clear on the role of the faculty. Do they buy into this?
Yeah, okay, let me describe the role of the faculty. What happens is there will always be people like myself on the faculty who are sympathetic, who think the students are right and the administration's wrong. I thought that, and I still think that to this day. I think we were right. And I had a special personal reason. Most people get involved in this for personal reasons, and that is in the old days of McCarthy, when I first came to this university, there was a movie made called Operation Abolition, which is about the student demonstrations trying to abolish the House Un-American Activities Committee. And the movie was going to be shown in the law school, and I was asked if I would comment on the movie because I had been active in these demonstrations. And an hour before my lecture, the chancellor's office called up the law school and canceled my appearance. And now here I was, an assistant professor in this university, and the vice chancellor said, you cannot have that dangerous radical speaking in Bolt Hall. He was also a professor at Bolt Hall. Now that is an outrage that's unbelievable because they were telling the students there's a member of the faculty who's so dangerous that we cannot allow him to speak unopposed. at Bolt Hall Law School. And they made a mistake with that because when the students came to me and said, well, we have a problem on this campus about free speech and we'd like to know if you'd help us out, they found in me a willing and enthusiastic audience. So I had a simple goal, and that was bring these bastards down. And I did. Now, it's true, I paid a price later on. The counter-revolution was much harder than the revolution. That's another story. There won't be any movies. That succeeded. We succeeded in that. So I had, and I think most people who were actively involved really had personal experiences. And my goal was very simple. What they did to me, they me or an professor, I didn't have tenure then, from giving a lecture on the campus. So we didn't get much free speech, so it was impossible to have somebody come and defend the war in Vietnam. But there was a change that resulted from that. Now, I was one guy, but there were lots of other faculty members. And what happens is you will always find faculty members who are sympathetic to, roughly speaking, a civil libertarian or generally liberal ideals. And you can get a fairly sizable number of people. I was once a member of a group called the Committee of 200. Another member is here. And the Committee of 200 was that. There were about 200 of us. And a bunch of us used to gather in Charlie Sellers' office and plan the next move. And I think it made a tremendous difference. Why? Because in the power vacuum, there was a power vacuum. And in the power vacuum, whoever picks up power has it. And what we did was draft the resolution that was passed on December 8th. And I think if you look at other revolutions, this is how they work. You see, the October Revolution in Russia was not a revolution. It was a coup d'etat. And the reason that Lenin could do it was there was a power vacuum. The provisional government was not really exercising power. They did not have the status acceptance necessary for the acceptance of power. So Lenin, with a group of really determined people, could seize power. Now, we're not Leninists, and there's nothing like that, but people who know what their objectives are and have enough intelligence to know how to achieve their objectives can do that, and that means you must have a certain number of respected members of the faculty who are willing to stick their neck out. Now, it's true, I thought, well, you know, they could probably have us fired if they really wanted to. I mean, I made speeches on Sparrow Plaza that were in violation of university rules. I had made a point of never breaking the law, but I'm sure there were lots of people who would swear that they saw me on top of the police car, that they saw me leading people in vandalism against university property. Idea is frankly vulgar. I would never do it. But I'm sure there are a lot of people who would swear that they saw me do that kind of stuff. So there were faculty members involved, and they made a crucial difference. No faculty support, no success. You will not succeed without faculty support. I didn't adequately emphasize that, but that's certainly the case. Yes, at the back.
Have you followed last week's protests?
I was actually in Madrid and didn't follow all of this, but there were quite serious demonstrations against the Conservative Party headquarters by students protesting fee increases. I'll be very interested to see how it plays out. Now, if they succeed, it will because the general public is outraged. I am outraged by the effect on higher education of the British government's proposals. And there's something going on that I'd like you people to be thinking about, because I don't get it. Here is what's going on. In the 1930s, there was a universally recognized international crisis in the form of the Great Depression. Now, there were two ways planned to cope with that. One way was a straight Keynesianism called deficit spending. You spend your way out of the Depression. There was an opposition to that was rather feeble intellectually, but the feeble intellectual opposition went, no, the free market has to be allowed to work. Now, the answer then was always, yeah, tell us how exactly. Okay, we let the free market work. What's going to happen? How is that going to increase employment? And they were wonderfully vague. The interesting thing is exactly that debate is repeated today. There is one section of the population which could have been writing these things in 1930s. Krugman's column in the New York Times, you should read it. He's not a dumb guy. He got the Nobel Prize. Well, maybe that's not a qualification. But in any case, he's reasonably intelligent. And he says they're not Keynes. There are all these other people who say, give us back our country. And what does that mean? That means get the government off our backs, lower taxes, get less government spending, shrink the government. And I think they might be worried if your intellectual leader of an entire national movement is Sarah Palin. However, I'm not the guy who's deciding the vote. Maybe that's how you get public policy made. So the interesting thing is that the same issues that occurred in the 30s are being repeated today, often in the same vocabulary. There is one structural difference, and that is Roosevelt was a very effective politician, and he made it clear from the beginning the Depression is their fault. Now, how did he do that? Well, the Depression began in 1929, in October, and Roosevelt didn't take power until 1933. That meant there were 3.5 years of terrible economic situation. And Roosevelt did something that I thought was outrageous, and that is after his election in November of 1932, he did nothing to try to help the Hoover administration get out of the Depression. Nothing. He just let them stew in their own juice. Then when he came to power, see, in those days, there was a long time between the election and the inauguration. The election was in November. The inauguration wasn't until March. So it wasn't until March that he came to power, and by that time, everybody believes the economy. Now, Obama wasn't so lucky. His taking power pretty much didn't coincide with, but it was a matter of months after the economic collapse. And thus he couldn't make it obvious that the unemployment is the fault of the other party. And it's not clear to me how this is going to work. What we lack is a Keynes. We lack somebody who can state exactly what our present economic situation is and why certain sorts of public policies are more likely to succeed than others. The closest we've got is a guy who's basically repeating Keynes, and that's Krugman in the New York Times. But maybe there's some other economist I don't know about. Incidentally, no nation was ever let down by an academic discipline as dramatically as the economists let us down beginning in 2008. And it's very interesting to see what they have to say about it. The standard is, well, my models work fine. I mean, what are you talking about? It's true that a lot of people are getting an extra vacation right now, but, you know, that's their problem. Yes?
How essential is it to this picture that it be by and about the students? I have in mind, for example, the recent protests in Greece and France for the austerity measures.
Yeah. This is not a general theory entitled to deal with all forms of protest. I do not hope to explain the French Revolution. I was confronted with a problem. My problem was, how the hell did it work in 1964 when we failed so spectacularly in 1951? And then I got interested, well, if it worked in Berkeley, why did it work so many other places? Why did it work at Columbia? Why did it work at Stanford or Harvard? And then I figured out there was a pattern that was being repeated. And the pattern, though I didn't have the vocabulary then, was undermining the legitimacy of a system of status functions until at the end the authorities have no authority. That no one pays attention if the chancellor makes a speech. Now the tragic figure in this was Clark Kerr, and I could tell you about his special problems later. Yeah.
What's interesting is it seems like the first two are met, right? I mean, clearly there's an issue, and it's a sacred topic if ever there was one, my God. And it does seem like there is this development of rhetorical climate.
Yeah.
But the authority, I guess, did not collapse, and I'm just curious as to like where the
yeah, okay. Well, I don't know the answer to that because I'm not a student of these things. I don't understand what happened in Greece. I don't even speak Greek. But the crucial difference is this. You have to be able to undermine the authority in such a way that the ultimate certifiers of the authority withdraw it. And then, in this case, was the faculty. If you convince the faculty that the present administration is no longer competent to run this university, you have won. And that's what happened in 1964. But what would you do in Greece? You'd convince the voters that the present government can't govern the country. And if you could do that, presumably you can vote them out. Yes?
These are criteria to satisfy a revolution, and you would call that a small revolution.
Yeah.
Well, this
Yeah.
would satisfy, I mean, I know the Russian Revolution well. The three criteria would satisfy the Russian Revolution
Yeah.
Also, and that was a revolution.
Yeah.
It was a coup d'etat in the beginning.
Yeah.
By October, and after they got rid of the provisional government, the collapse of authority was all there.
Yeah. Well, okay. I read a book. When I got interested in this, I started reading books. And there's a book by Crane Brinton, which was sort of the standard textbook about the structure of revolutions. It seemed to me very superficial. It seemed to me it was kind of journalism that he was doing. It was sort of journalistic histories. And I didn't have this vocabulary then, I don't think he understood how the structure of status functions has to be supported by collective recognition and acceptance. And if you withdraw the collective recognition and acceptance, authority collapses. See, on a day-to-day basis, you simply yield to authorities. If the administration says there will be a holiday next week, well, no, none of us are going to revolt by going to class. I mean, we just blindly we accept the authority. But in 1964 and beginning in 1965, there simply was no authority of the university administration on this campus. No one paid much attention. We all thought, we now have carte blanche, we can start doing anything we want. The French Revolution is the beautiful case study. They even decided we have to have a new calendar. We can no longer be slaves to the old calendar. I have a wonderful map. It said, l'Ontoit de la Révolution Française. And that means if this map was printed in year 3 of the Revolution. So its history begins with us. That is the mark of the real revolutionary. And the sense of exhilaration you feel, the sense of possibility. We're no longer constrained by the dead hand of the past. We can now create a new civilization if we're French in 1789, or what the hell, a new campus if we're Berkeley in 1965. And this is a wonderfully, almost ecstatic feeling that people had. Yes?
So, in my understanding, every time a revolution or you have a student movement in this category works, you crumble this authority.
Yeah.
And then you have the authority vacuum, and what's there is the present constitution, which retakes the power again, and voila, nothing has changed.
Yeah, well, I think there's something to what you say, so let me expand on it a little bit. When you have a power vacuum, something has to fill it. Now, part of the problem with the radical student movements of the 60s is that they had no theory of social change or of social structure. The theory was, there's evil, we're going to fight evil. When we fight evil, then what? Well, find another evil, go fight that. But the idea that somehow or other, if you've destroyed the authority of the university, there has to be some new authority. No, that's not what they wanted. The whole theory of the FSM was it was anti-bureaucratic. And what did it do at its moment of greatest success? It abolished itself. The FSM, I mean, in a way, it's to their credit. They lived up to their ideals. They simply said, we ceased to exist. This was in early 65. They simply abolished themselves. So what happened? Well, the administration tried to rebuild the structure of authority of the traditional university, and in the end they succeeded. Martin Meyerson came in and had a problem because he really had no authority to exercise, and when he tried to exercise it looked like the FSM was going to be repeated all over again, so that failed. So then a new chancellor came in the fall of 65, Chancellor Hines, and he said to me, in effect, look, you tore the place down, now you got to put it back together, and you can't say you're not interested in these university affairs. You know, I couldn't say, well, I'm just a philosopher, I don't care about. You know, there's a wonderful story in the Revolution of 1830 of a man walking past a barricade, and he sees a child rifleman with a musket shooting at the police. And he says, kid, that's not the way to do it. Let me show you how to do it. So he loads the musket and promptly kills a policeman, gives the musket back. And the kid says, no, you keep the musket, you fire the gun. And he said, no, ça m'intéresse pas en politique. I don't care about politics. I'm not interested in politics. Well, I couldn't say that. I couldn't say I'm not interested in politics. So I went in the chancellor's office for a couple of years, and that was a much harder battle to try to reestablish the authority of the university. And the hardest thing was to create a situation where you could make a mistake and still survive. See, the problem in the early days was if you made a mistake after breakfast, you had 1,000 policemen on the campus at lunchtime. And you can't live like that. Yeah, you've got to be able to make simple mistakes. Of course, if your mistakes are too outrageous, then get rid of us if necessary. So I had to reestablish a situation when the administration could make forgivable mistakes and get away with it. They wouldn't be forgiven, but at least they could get away with it, and that's the situation we're now in. The authority of the university administration is not really threatened, and in fact, these present guys have no idea what it was like in 1965. They have an easy life. They have a harder life in one respect, and that is in 1965 we took money for granted. The chancellor never had to ask anybody for money. Now the chancellor, that's his main job, is to try to beg money. Chancellor Hines never had to ask anybody for money. There was money pouring in on us all the time. And money we didn't get from the state, we got from the feds. Okay, there were other questions. You and then you. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I don't know. I was not, I thought the whole thing was so boring and stupid I didn't get interested, and I'm no doubt I should have. But my experience was in the 60s, if you're going to arouse, and I mean arouse, middle-class American students, to get thousands of them to risk their education and their career, or at least think that's what they're doing. They wouldn't really be, because people will forgive them. But to think they're risking their education and their career, it has to be in the name of a high moral ideal. You can't tell them, you come out and demonstrate successfully for us, and we'll save you $10,000 a year, or save your parents $10,000 a year. That won't, middle-class Americans will not fight and die for a budgetary increase. Now, maybe, again, experience is the worst teacher. Maybe there's going to be a new change. Maybe there's going to be a new kind of history. But that was the experience in the 60s. No student movement in the 60s over self-interest ever succeeded. Now, again, I didn't follow the black colleges very well, and it may be that was different there. That was a very special cultural situation, and I'm just not familiar with that. But for middle-class white students, there has to be a universal moral ideal, or they will not, as we used to say, put our lives and our bodies on the line. At least that's what we thought we were doing. Yeah.
So is it just that, like, trying to couch an issue that has such a personal investment, or like?
The way it works is this, and this is why they succeeded in a way we could not have succeeded in the 1950s. They found how to tie universal moral issues to very local university authorities. So it's very hard to strike a blow for peace in Vietnam by bringing down the federal government or the Defense Department or getting Congress to change its vote. But it's very easy to occupy the dean's office, and you can get a lot of people to do it if you can convince them that that's how you strike a blow against the war in Vietnam. That was the remarkable feature of the 1960s. And I'm not suggesting cynicism. People really believed this. They really thought, we are look, I'll tell you a silly point in my life. I think I've mentioned this before. But we had a march to Oakland, to the Oakland Army base. And a lot of students marched in the streets to Oakland. And by the way, newspapermen are just lazy. It was very easy to count the number of people in the march. I just went to the head of the march and counted by tens as people went past. There were about 8,000 in the march. Standard press account was anywhere from 14,000 to 20,000. And this is true of any demonstration. Those are always overrated. Why? Well, it's in the interest of the demonstrators and the interest of the reporters that it should seem like a big event. So you always list more people than were actually there. It's easy enough to count. And if you got 100,000, you take photographs and count sections of the photograph and multiply. It's not a big deal. Okay, so there were 8,000. But I remember talking to some kids in the march, and they said, now, after this march, they'll have to stop the bombing. Well, I try to tell them, in the Pentagon and the White House, they don't give a damn about a march to Oakland by some 8,000 Berkeley students. But the conception that they had of power was that this must be the decisive feature. This must change government policy when they realized that 8,000 of us, they read 14,000 or 20,000, went out to march. They didn't really care much about that. And as I told you, I then went and worked in the Nixon White House and tried to tell them what a mess they were making of the country. And they were really puzzled. Nixon in particular was very puzzled because he remembered his old student days, and student didn't do this kind of stuff when he was, wherever he was a student. Whittier, was it Whittier College? Yeah, Whittier College. Well, it just, you know, he just didn't remember things like this, so he had no real feel for what was going on or what it meant to people. Okay, other questions? Those are good questions. Yeah?
You've mentioned a couple times the role of theory.
Yeah. Yes, no, the theory was essential. Now, the theory was rather half-baked, and there were, interesting thing is, no good philosophers. But the one who was appealed to in Europe, much more in Europe than the United States, was Herbert Marcuse. And I happened to attend a riot with Marcuse. And in fact, he was with me on this famous march to Oakland. And there was a moment where the Berkeley students were confronted by the Hell's Angels. And here were these guys in black leather jackets and motorcycles. And Marcuse became excited in a way that I can only describe as erotic when he said, it's fascism, it's fascism, it's fascism. And European intellectuals have always been bothered by the fact that fascism never took hold in the United States. There never was a fascism. He thought the fascist movement had finally come. Men in black leather jackets beating up students. And I said, no, it's not fascism. It's just the Hell's Angels. Europeans can never get fascism in America has always been a joke. I was at a dinner party in Berlin once, and they were talking about a philosopher, a professional philosopher in Germany whose name was Horst Wessel. Now, that doesn't mean anything to you, but Horst Wessel was the name of the famous martyr. And there's a Horst Wessel lied, a song about Horst Wessel. And they thought, well, you know, this is the kind of thing people did under Nazi. They named their children after Horst Wessel. And so then, as a kind of a joke, I burst into the Horst Wessel song. Die Fahne hoch, die Reihe festgeschlossen, SA marschiert, and so on. And they were appalled that I would do this. And they said, it's Neofascismus. And I couldn't explain to them, bei uns ist es komisch. It's a joke. In America, you sing the Horst Wessel song the way you sing the Red Flag or Spangen's Himmel. There are all these old goofy left-wing and right-wing songs. And in high school, we all learned them as a joke. Nobody ever took it seriously. Europeans don't understand that. They think that it always has to express some deep philosophical commitment. Okay, Marcuse had a sort of a theory. And the theory was called repressive tolerance. And the way it is the very fact that you're given free speech is a form of oppression. Why? Because the normal resistance that would come to oppression is now removed, and consequently you can't really protest against oppression because the tolerance you get represses your resistance. Now, if that sounds to you like an unclear piece of philosophy, I share your doubts. But the difficulty was there wasn't much. The theory of society wasn't worth a damn. But insofar as there was a theory, it went something like this. The structure of power in America, as I told you earlier, is a seamless fabric. It's a mistake to think that these middle-level people like congressmen and senators, they don't have power. The real power is exercised by the military-industrial complex. It's exercised by the generals in the Pentagon and the heads of the corporations who are selling napalm and guns to the government, which the government then uses to impose its oppressive imperialistic aims on the whole world and to bomb the life out of innocent Vietnamese peasants. And that power, the power that is killing Vietnamese peasants, is right there in the dean's office. Why? Because what the dean is doing, Mario told us, is creating raw material for the military-industrial complex. You're creating raw material so that people can go out and spread more napalm or do more bombing. Insofar as there was a theory, this was the theory. The theory was that in spite of our apparent freedom, in fact, the whole system is oppressive. The whole structure in the United States is oppressive. And people who cared about these issues would cite Marcuse to the effect that the appearance of liberty was itself a form of oppression because it stifled active dissent. The way that you stifled dissent was by giving people free speech to exercise dissent. It's a tough choice then. Either way, you're stifling dissent. Okay, so there was a theory, but it wasn't much of a theory. And one of the striking things about the 60s was the impoverished intellectual level of the philosophy behind radicalism. Chomsky was a kind of a guru, but in fact the people never understood Chomsky. It isn't that he thought the United States was bad and other governments were good. He hated all governments. He once described his philosophy to me as Marxist anarchism. If that sounds like an oxymoron to you, I think it is an oxymoron. But in any case, and I think to this day, that's how he thinks of himself. He's against all governments. All governments are evil. When Nixon got kicked out of office, he thought, oh, Nixon's no worse than any other president. They're all alike. And just the very fact of being presidents. And when he discovered that I no longer held the left-wing views that he had thought I had held, he said, well, it's the institutional corruption. You actually went to work in a university for the administration, and that will destroy. Didn't change my opinions at all, but it changed the perception. So Chomsky was a kind of inspiration on specific issues, but he offered no theory of society and social change. So I can't think of anybody who was I mean, what are you going to say? That sociologist from Wisconsin who wrote White Collar. What's his name? C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills, well, people read Mills, but I don't think he was a source of inspiration. So Marxism by that time was no longer a lively force in the United States. It was in Europe. So you had the absurdity in 1968 of people protesting in Paris and in West Berlin when there actually was a real oppression being protested against in Prague. See, the Prague Spring were confronting a real oppressive government, namely the version of Soviet communism that existed in the Czech Republic. But students in the West found it actually invisible. Didn't see it. It didn't mean anything to them. What they were really concerned about were things like the war in Vietnam. And a thing that made a tremendous difference was the draft. Once the draft was removed, a great deal of the motive force was taken away from student radicalism. Now, I was going to spend a lot of time today discussing such minor issues as the nature of human rights and why socialism failed. But maybe I won't even get started on those today. Let's take a couple more questions. Yeah, I don't know if this is fun or not, but I wanted you to see the movie so you'd see how the theory of social ontology that I've been explaining to you is supposed to apply in real life. It's supposed to be a real-life test case. Please don't snap your notebooks yet. We got at least 3 minutes, and we can cover a lot of ground in 3 minutes in this house. Yes?
You mentioned here and there that the counter-revolutionists are in there.
What?
The counter-revolution?
Oh, ironic remark. Okay, what happened was in 1965, in late 1964 and in 1965, there was the characteristic psychology of a revolution, and that is no authority was recognized, and there was a sense of enormous possibility. We can recreate life. We're just going to have a totally different kind of society. It isn't just we'll have a totally different university, we'll have a completely different society. All kinds of things will be possible that would never have been possible before. And if you go back and read about the French Revolution, this is characteristic. This is characteristic of revolutionary movements. Now, it has wonderful appeal. The only thing is you can't run a university on that basis. Alas, universities are based on the principle of discipline. I hate to say it because it's a very unpleasant word, but that's it. You must have a kind of discipline. You must feel, well, look, I got a final exam coming up. I got a paper due next week. I'm going to apply to law school. And without this kind of tedious conformity and discipline, you don't get anything done in universities. Now, the very words conformity and discipline make me want to throw up. I'm opposed to the whole idea. I'll never forget when I was a freshman at Wisconsin, the fraternities issued a brochure saying you should join a fraternity to learn conformity and discipline. Well, I thought if there are two things I hate, those are the two. I don't want to do that. The only thing worse than that was a guy called me up and said, come down to Sigma Nu for a little fun and fellowship. Yuck. As we say in Wisconsin, ça fait vomir. I wanted to throw up. Okay, but all the same, whatever vocabulary you put it in, universities require an awful lot of, and here I'll use some other equally offensive jargon, delayed gratification. Yes, it's no fun doing your homework tonight. Maybe on the weekend you can have some fun, but you have to do this. It has to be done. There have to be exams and grades and degrees. If nobody wanted degrees, we wouldn't have to give them grades and exams. And I had to recreate a situation where that could exist, where the professors could teach courses, give exams. The university could have various rules about what you could do and what you could not do. And basically, we succeeded. It was 2 very difficult years of my life. But what happened was, in 1968, when the rest of the country, and indeed the rest of Europe, blew up in the universities, nothing happened in Berkeley. Berkeley, we had more or less complete control. Now, in 1969, something happened off campus that was really not a university matter, and that was the People's Park, and that was another disaster. And Reagan, again, proved to be a great politician because he said one thing and did another. What he said was, we got to impose really tough discipline in Berkeley. But when a guy got killed, he just pulled back. He just drew back. So he understood. He's an actor. And what he understood is what you have to do is convey an image. It doesn't matter what you do. In reality, you have to convey the image. So he conveyed the image of strict discipline, whereas, in fact, what he did when the going got tough was just pull back. I don't know quite how we got off onto this, but in any case, I think now I've used up my minutes. Okay, now, next time we're going to do something much more interesting. We're going to talk about the ontology of human rights, and also I'll explain why socialism failed.